53% of Gen Zers identify as sports fans compared to 63% of all adults and 69% of millennials. I think that it's pretty obvious that sports, specifically, I almost had a stroke there, traditional sports like baseball, football, basketball, are falling to the wayside from previous generations. Now, I think that a lot of what goes into this is like sociological and just kind of like how people think and live nowadays. One of the things that I think is a really big difference is what are kids' hobbies. So when I was growing up, and I'm over 30, so when I was growing up, it was a very different generation or a very different lifestyle than currently. There was no such thing as phones. There was no such thing as social media. There was no such thing as really even computers. I didn't have a computer with internet at my house until I was like 16 years old. So I have a good idea of what it was like way before what it currently is like. And I can go ahead and tell you that 90%, I would say, of people that were in my class or people I knew played Little League Baseball, Little League Football, Little League Basketball, whatever. I would guess that number is drastically reduced. Kids just do different stuff, and parents do different stuff. You know, parents don't just sit at home, wait for their kids to come home anymore. They're not just sitting there cooking dinner. You know, they have their lives, so kids may be sent to after school care. They may be on computers or on social media more and are removed from the idea of maybe your typical where sports is a hobby from a really young age. Gen Zers are half as likely as millennials to watch live sports regularly and twice as likely to never watch. This is another thing where, and you know, I'm just theorizing here, but I think there's also a conversation of like attention, like how much or how willing are Gen Zers to sitting down and watching a 3-hour sporting game or a 2.5-hour game, or would they rather watch 20 minutes of Netflix, 30 minutes of YouTube, 40 minutes of Twitch, and keep bouncing around? That's why baseball has such a big problem. Baseball has such a big problem because it's a 4-hour game. Like, you have no clue how long the game's going to be. I don't even watch baseball, and I like baseball because I can't sit down every night and say, all right, I'm going to give this game 4 hours of my attention, 3 hours of my attention. There's no surprise that soccer is becoming so much more popular because soccer is 2 hours. Soccer is no commercials. There's no commercials in a soccer game. There's the start of the game, there's halftime, there's the end of the game. The clock's always running. You know exactly how long the game's going to be, which is really positive for this new kind of viewing audience. Esports are more popular among Gen Z than MLB, NASCAR, and the NHL, with 35% identifying as fans. Exactly what I'm talking about. New hobbies. You know, kids are growing up playing Fortnite. They're not growing up playing Little League Baseball. Kobe Bryant and LeBron James ranked as Gen Z's favorite sports figures with 11% and 10% of selections. That's fine. The millennial generation's coming of age coincided with massive growth in North American sports industry between 2010 and 2018. Sports market grew more than 40%. I think this is a big part of how TV worked. TV, I think in general, had a boom, and these networks had a boom, and all of that had a big boom. So this isn't just sports industry. I think this is more the idea of like how stuff is consumed with media, especially later on where everything's streamable. So, you know, fueled primarily by skyrocketing media rights. Yeah, so this is exactly right. So that, like, the NFL has a $3 billion TV deal with ESPN. You know, so like that's obviously going to make the business boom. More access than ever to a wider range of competitions. Yes. Men and women born between 81 and 96 developed an insatiable appetite for live sports, lifting leagues, teams, networks, and brands to unprecedented heights. So I'm right in here. I'm in the middle of this. And yeah, I mean, sports was a huge deal. You know, when I was growing up, I watched almost every single Atlanta Braves game, and for sure, this was a big thing. Gen Z is much less enthusiastic about sports. Those born between 97 and 2012 accounted for 20.3% of the U.S. population as of July 2019. Another thing I think you'll see with sports is people are so just kind of normalized to the idea of moving around. They're so fluid, like where they live. They don't, you know, when I was growing up, it was never, you never thought of like, oh, well, I'm born in Mississippi, but maybe I'll go work in Austin, Texas, or maybe I'll go work in California. You know, like that wasn't it. It was pretty much like an hour radius around you. So with knowing that, it's easier to be like, okay, I'm all in on this team. I'm all in on these players. This is my home team. But people are so fluid with how they move now and where they go now that I think it's harder for people to drop anchor on sports teams. I have a friend of mine who he grew up in Mississippi, and he left and he moved to Tampa for a little bit, came back. But while he was in Tampa, he became a big fan of the Rays. So for him, now he doesn't live in Tampa. So it's like at one point, he was a huge fan of the Rays. Now, he may like the Rays, but is he a huge fan? Probably not as much as he was when he was in Tampa. I think you see a lot of that happening now where kids are going to different colleges, kids are going to different, or not kids, but they're going to different regions. They may be working for different teams, rooting for different teams. It's much less of like, I'm born in this region, thus I'm a fan of this team. And as that wanes, I think that like a diehard fan base will wane as well. Let's see. And now, an analysis of recent morning consult polls, Gen Zers currently are less likely than the general population to identify as sports fans. 53% of 1,000 Gen Zers consider themselves sports fans, compared with 63% of U.S. adults and 69% of millennials in a subsequent survey. Okay, I think that's still, you're cutting into the hobbies and you're cutting into what people do a little bit more. There are more hobbies nowadays. There are more, like, for example, let's say yoga, right? 10 years ago, yoga was big, but it wasn't what it is now, where now you find YouTube channels on yoga, you find Twitch channels, you find Instagram, you find all this stuff on yoga. So if you're interested in yoga, or if you're interested in whatever, you can kind of go all in on that. Rock climbing, yoga, kiteboarding, cooking, gardening, whatever. Back in the day, it was pretty much like a pie, where you had sports, you had books, you had, it was very linear. It was like sports, books, movies, music. Now it's like little subsections of everything. So I think people are less likely to just fall into sports because there's so much other stuff. Starker on the male side, 58% of male Gen Zers said they were sports fans, compared to 75% of adult men. Again, I think that's generational, well, it's obviously generational, but I think it's like when you think about what it was like for a man 20 years ago, they were expected to like sports. And now that's just not the case. Now there isn't that you're expected to like sports, you're expected to lift weights, you're expected to do this as a guy. That's obviously done and dusted. So I think that, and it's not for better or for worse. I think that's just how it is, where if you're a kid, if you're in the mid 90s, if you're a 7-year-old kid, a boy, and you're not playing Little League Baseball, people are going to wonder why. Like, what else are you doing? But now, no one gives a shit if you play Little League Baseball or not. You could be doing a million other things. It's easier for a parent to be like, well, we're putting him in piano lessons. He's not playing baseball. Back then, you would never thought to do that. That list right there makes a lot of sense for my generation as far as what sports rank as Gen Z's most favorite. NBA over college football and MLB and NHL, and I'll explain why as well. Members of Gen Z were less likely to identify as fans of specific sports properties relative to the broader adult population and other corresponding poll. Of the 27 sports or competitions including in the survey, members of the general adult population are more likely than Gen Zers to identify as fans of 24 of them. The only sports wherein Gen Zers over-index as fans were esports and the NBA, while the share of all adults that identified as fans of USC was equal to that of Gen Z. The reason I think the NBA does so well is because it's so viral. The actual action is so viral, where like a dunk or and the athletes are these like crossover stars, where a lot of basketball players are crossing over with Instagram, or they're in fashion. You see dunks, you see highlight passes, you see all that stuff. Whereas in the MLB, that's like the least viral sport of all time. You never see home runs or great plays or whatever on Instagram or on Sports Center. You always see NBA stuff. And NBA has 5 players on the court, so it's a star-driven league. So players or fans can say, I like LeBron James. I can watch this NBA game because I can literally see LeBron James the whole time. If you like Bryce Harper for the MLB, Bryce Harper may only be on your screen for like 7 minutes a game, whereas LeBron James is on it for a very large portion. So if you're star driven, because obviously these fans are not team driven, we've already explained why. The fans are not team driven because they don't have that connection to the region or they don't have that connection to the team. So they're star driven because they have connections to social media, connections to these athletes' Instagrams, to their Twitters, whatever. So they want to see the stars. What sports do you see the stars the most, right? Versus which ones do you not? It's really simple to figure out why some of these sports are succeeding and why some of them are failing. It's a combination of who they're watching and how they're watching them. NHL suffers from, NHL has been one of those things where they've actually talked about taking the helmets off the players to make them more easily identifiable so that fans can watch their favorite players versus a bunch of people in helmets. So those are interesting conversations. Gen Zers are twice as likely as millennials to say they never watch live sports. Well, yeah, Gen Zers don't watch live really anything. It's you got to think about back then, and I'm going to say that a lot back then because we're comparing two different eras. But back then, if you didn't watch live sports, your only other option was watching SportsCenter. Well, now I missed the Arsenal Liverpool game because it was on Peacock. I can go back and watch the entire game on Arsenal's website. I can go to their Instagram and watch all the goals. I can go to Liverpool's Instagram, watch all their goals. I can go to YouTube, watch all the highlights. So there's so many more options to watch the games or to watch what happens in the games versus watching the live sport. So if these people are like, well, I'm not watching the game live because I want to catch up on Game of Thrones, they will watch Game of Thrones. They'll watch Game of Thrones and then they'll catch up on the highlights of a sporting game in bed that night or whatever. We just watched the Saints-Packers highlights. We basically watched the entire game in 13 minutes on a YouTube video. I'm a mix, always just been a LeBron fan because he started in Cleveland and that's in Ohio. Then I just stay with him, but other than that, it's all Ohio teams. Yeah, some people for sure are regional, and I'm pretty sure this is right. But you've never lived outside of Ohio, correct? Like you never went to school or worked or anything like that. Yeah. Okay. See, so that makes sense, right? That makes total sense. If you're still in the region, then you're going to be a fan of those teams. But let's say next year you lived in New Orleans. And let's say you lived in New Orleans and you went to a bunch of Pelicans games and Saints games. And you lived there for like 5 years. And you were in the culture and all of a sudden you probably will become sort of a Pelicans fan or sort of a Saints fan. And will that be forever? Who knows? If you move somewhere else, you probably will drop them and all that stuff. So, it's a little bit of all over the place for people where everything is so easily accessible and so easy to move around and so fluid that people will pick up these little pockets of teams, these little pockets of, okay, so I'm in Columbus, still repping Seattle. I'm sort of a Blue Jackets Crew fan now. So I went to one Blue Jackets game, when I was in Columbus. When I see the NHL schedule, I always look and see the Blue Jackets. I'm always like, I hope they're doing good. Just because I went to one game and I really enjoyed it and I had fun and I liked Columbus. I've only been there once, but I don't have an NHL team. So even though I'm so far away from Ohio and I've only been there once, it's like they're probably a top 3-ish team for me in the NHL, So that's how I think people now are gaining their fanhood versus like before you got your fanhood from your lineage. It was passed down to you from your parents. It was passed down from you from your grandparents. And now I think people are getting their fanhood from experiences and not from lineage. You're much more likely to be a fan of a team that you go to a game to, that you live in the city of, when those kind of things, versus my grandpa liked that team or my dad liked that team. I live in New Jersey, and the only sports teams we have is the Red Devils, the Red Bulls. Yeah, so you're a fan of them, right? Because you live there. Yeah, so let's keep on in this And this right here. The keys to growing live viewership among young fans are accessibility and opportunities for engagement. True. Sports properties need to make sure their games are digestible and available via streaming products. They need to make their games engaging by fostering gamification, daily fantasy, free-to-play games, and ultimately sports betting. So this is another idea, right? The other idea is that everything is becoming gamified. There's this gamification. I would guess the NFL is so high up here with Gen Z because of how popular fantasy football is. So many people play fantasy football and watch certain games because of those players. And as the more that stuff gets gamified, the more that stuff like that happens, the more that that's going to shift how you watch a game. So instead of rooting for the Packers, you're rooting specifically for Aaron Rodgers. And you don't really care about the outcome of the game as long as Aaron Rodgers has a good game. And the more that sports leagues do that, the more that happens, the more you'll see the shift goes from the game and the team to the player or whatever the game, like whatever the gamified thing is, whether it's daily fantasy or a sports bet or whatever. Well, most professional, college, and amateur sports properties have sought to reach Gen Z via social media. Leaders in the industry said individual athletes play an outsized role in generating. That's exactly what I just said. So fans care more about the stars. They don't care about the teams. They care about who they are actually rooting for. And that's because we are closer to stars than ever before. If you're a fan of LeBron James, you can see LeBron James' Instagram, his Twitter, his YouTube, his Snapchat, him in the games, whatever. So this shift is your team will not succeed. Your team will not be relevant without a superstar. We talked about the Cincinnati Bengals before. One of my cousins watches every Cincinnati Bengals game and follows it because he is a huge fan of Joe Burrow. And that all of a sudden now makes him a Bengals fan. I think he even bought a Bengals sweatshirt recently. And I'm in South Mississippi, So these stars are transcending the actual team they play for. And that's a big shift. And that's something where as streaming and YouTube and stuff takes off and you see these players develop followings on Twitter and Twitch and Instagram, you're going to see a lot more of that. You're going to see a lot more of following players, rooting for players versus rooting for organizations. Kids are following athletes first, then they're following clubs, then they're following leagues because they want that one-to-one connection with the athlete or the athletes they admire. Something else that people want to be a part of or want to do nowadays is be a part of something. So you see a lot of people, that's why people are so involved socially as far as like movements, whether it's BLM or whatever people are involved in, they want to be involved in something. I was heavily involved in the MLS, Major League Soccer, and the National Women's Soccer League. And I thought that I felt like I was part of like the ground floor because I was supporting the league before anyone else was. I mean, this is probably a decade ago. And I was watching a lot of those leagues to support the leagues. And then you slowly, develop, you're supporting the teams and then whatever. But so I've been there where I was supporting the league. But again, that's a different mindset. I'm from a different era than the Gen Z demographic they're talking about here. And that's why you see things like #United, right, with Spencer FC's sports teams, is that these Gen Zers, they know #United from YouTube, from Spencer. They can follow all the players. They can follow all the esports talent. And so now they feel like they're part of this group. They're part of this unit because they have been so invested in them from the start through social media. So thus, they become huge fans of the team. Esports properties in particular benefit from the fact their athletes are far more accessible to fans. Obviously, esports athletes are streaming for hours on end outside of their typical competition. And when they're streaming, they're exposing their personality. They're interacting with their audience. Yeah, I mean, like, look, if I all of a sudden became a professional esports athlete, everyone in this chat would be be rooting for me in my esport. So it'd be so easy to go from this stream to whatever esport I started playing. If I started to be a competitive chess player, even if you didn't watch chess or care about chess, you'd be like, well, I want this guy to win. I watch his stream. I watch his YouTube, We have 1,000 Gen Zers to name their favorite sports figures. And all of these people have huge social media followings. Bottom line, enormous. 4 of Gen Z's 5. Okay. The NHL is investigating and educating its players about how to effectively use social media. Very important. They share with hockey athletes are so quiet off the ice. They're amazing and the best athletes on ice. When they're off the ice, they're not present on social media. They're quiet. Yeah, like that stuff's not great, you know. And that's why the UFC is so strong, is because what happens during every single fight? Every single fight, one of the two people gets interviewed. All right, they have walkouts, they have songs, they get interviewed, they talk directly to the camera. So even if they aren't these huge social media people, they are way more social than many other sports. I mean, Conor McGregor is probably at one point was the biggest athlete or the most known, most popular athlete in the world, and it's because he's so vocal. Every fight, people look forward to Joe Rogan's interview after the fight. They want to see what happens, who gets called out, all that stuff. And you see household names get made from just one interview, from one quip. And that's just the world we live in nowadays. So I think sports will be fine. It's just that people will view it, watch it, and digest it very differently moving forward. But yeah, I mean, it's kind of funny because like when I grew up, I wasn't passed down any team. Like the closest teams to me was like the Braves were a couple hours away, Saints were a couple hours away, so I gravitated to them. But I didn't have like a family allegiance to anybody, and so I kind of found my own way. And the reason I became a Saints fan really was because I started going to the games. I was pretty indifferent on the Saints, and then I started going to the games. And as I went to all those games, I felt like I was part of the community. And so they became my favorite team. And, so the different strokes for different folks. If you're born in Seattle and you live in Seattle, like obviously you're going to be a fan of those teams. But there's a lot of cities in the United States where you're in the middle of everything, and you don't know what team to root for and why to root for them and all that stuff. So it can be difficult for sure.